Welcome to Alcott Stories, where love, transformation, and the power of the human spirit take center stage. Here, we tell stories that break barriers, challenge prejudice, and show that true love is more than just skin deep. From heart-wrenching tales of overcoming adversity to life-changing journeys of self-discovery, we dive deep into the stories that inspire, heal, and change hearts. If you believe in the power of love to conquer all, you're in the right place. So hit that subscribe button and join us on a journey where every story matters. Amelia's journey at the prestigious tech firm wasn't just about climbing the corporate ladder. It was a reflection of her resilience and ambition. From the moment she stepped into the modern glass-walled building, she had a vision for herself. Her polished demeanor, sharp intellect, and unrelenting work ethic quickly earned her a reputation as one of the brightest minds in the company. Yet, for all her accomplishments, she was no stranger to the subtle challenges that came with her identity. Her striking appearance, a beautiful blend of poise and confidence, often caught the eye of her colleagues. But beneath the surface, Amelia knew that her smooth, ebony skin and heritage sometimes drew judgmental glances rather than genuine admiration. She often overheard whispered comments at the water cooler, remarks that reminded her she had to work twice as hard to be seen as equal. Amelia's professional world was a carefully balanced act. She excelled in meetings, presenting innovative ideas that pushed the company forward. Her confidence never wavered, even when she was interrupted or underestimated. But what truly set her apart was her unyielding determination to rise above the biases she faced, a quiet strength that defined her character. Then there was David, the CEO, a man whose presence dominated the room effortlessly. With his tailored suits, confident stride, and warm yet authoritative voice, David was admired by all. His leadership had steered the company to remarkable success, and employees looked up to him with a mix of respect and awe. Amelia couldn't help but admire him too. It wasn't just his professional success, it was the way he treated people. David had a knack for making everyone feel seen, even if only briefly. A genuine smile during a meeting, a casual compliment on a well-crafted report, or a quick "great work" as he passed by were small gestures that carried immense weight. To Amelia, these moments felt like whispers of encouragement, as if he could see the effort she poured into her work. But admiration soon turned into something more. Over time, Amelia found herself thinking about him beyond the confines of the office. She noticed the way he ran a hand through his hair during moments of deep thought, or how his eyes lit up when discussing ideas he was passionate about. These details, insignificant to others, began to linger in her mind. Yet she suppressed her feelings, knowing the risks. Her logical side reminded her of the unspoken rules of their worlds. A black woman falling for her white CEO? Be realistic, she would tell herself. The fear of rejection, compounded by the societal barriers they both lived within, loomed large. But Amelia's heart couldn't ignore the magnetic pull she felt toward David. Even as she stayed late to perfect a presentation, she would catch herself daydreaming about what it would be like to have a deeper connection with him. She scolded herself for indulging in such thoughts, yet they persisted, quietly embedding themselves into her everyday life. Unbeknownst to Amelia, David had also taken notice of her. Though he couldn't fully articulate why, he found her presence refreshing. Her passion, intelligence, and unflinching honesty during discussions made her stand out in a sea of voices. While David respected her professionally, he had never considered the possibility of anything beyond that. In the bustling office environment, their interactions remained professional but warm. Amelia, ever the composed professional, ensured her feelings stayed hidden. But in those fleeting moments when their eyes met across the boardroom table, or when he casually complimented her ideas, her heart raced with possibilities she dared not entertain. Amelia's admiration for David wasn't just about his charm or success. It was the way he made her believe in her potential. But with each passing day, she questioned whether her feelings would ever be reciprocated. Her insecurities whispered cruel reminders. The world often didn't view people like her as worthy of such affections. As Amelia navigated her professional life, her silent yearning became a lesson in patience and self-awareness. Despite her growing emotions, she continued to excel at her job, proving that her worth extended far beyond anyone's perception of her. Little did she know the journey she was about to embark on would challenge her strength, redefine her perspective on love, and ultimately send ripples through a society grappling with its own prejudices. The office, with its polished floors and corporate culture, became the stage for a story that would test the boundaries of love, identity, and acceptance. Through it all, Amelia remained true to herself, a woman of integrity, courage, and a heart full of dreams. Amelia's admiration for David slowly evolved into something much deeper. It wasn't a sudden realization, but a quiet, growing feeling that began to color her thoughts and emotions. Every interaction with him, whether it was his warm smile during a team meeting or the subtle nod of approval he gave when she presented her ideas, added another layer to her emotions. Her heart fluttered whenever he walked into the room, his commanding presence making everything else fade into the background. She noticed things about him that others seemed to overlook, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the thoughtful pause before he spoke, and the way he carried himself with effortless grace. These details, though small, were etched into her mind like poetry. Yet, for all her admiration, Amelia couldn't ignore the nagging voice in her head. "He's your boss," it whispered, "and you're you. A black woman in a world that still sees color before character." At night, these thoughts haunted her. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments from the day. What if he saw her as nothing more than another employee? What if her feelings were foolish, a product of her own longing for connection in a world that often made her feel invisible? Why would someone like him ever see someone like me as his equal? She wondered, her chest tightening with self-doubt. The barriers of race and societal expectations loomed large in her mind, threatening to extinguish the flicker of hope that had taken root in her heart. Despite these fears, Amelia couldn't deny the truth. She had fallen in love with David. It wasn't just his charm or good looks. It was the kindness he showed to others, the way he encouraged innovation, and his ability to make people feel valued. In him, she saw the qualities of a man she could admire, respect, and love deeply. Her best friend Nina was the only person Amelia confided in. Over a glass of wine one evening, she finally admitted her feelings. "Nina, I think I'm in love with him," Amelia said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nina raised an eyebrow, her expression a mix of surprise and concern. "David? Your CEO?" Amelia nodded, looking down at her hands. "I know it's crazy. He's everything I'm not. And society doesn't exactly celebrate relationships like that." Nina reached out and placed a comforting hand on her friend's shoulder. "Amelia, love doesn't care about rules or expectations. If you feel this strongly, maybe you owe it to yourself to tell him. What's the worst that could happen?" Amelia hesitated. The worst-case scenarios played out in her mind. Rejection, humiliation, or worse, the loss of respect in the workplace. But Nina's words ignited a spark of courage. For the first time, Amelia allowed herself to believe in the possibility that love might transcend the barriers of race and color. Over the next few days, she struggled with her decision. She spent hours drafting and deleting text messages she would never send. She rehearsed conversations in front of her mirror, her voice shaky with nerves. Every time she imagined confessing her feelings, fear gripped her. One evening, as she gazed out of her apartment window at the city lights, Amelia made up her mind. "I can't live with this what-if hanging over me," she said to herself. "Even if it doesn't work out, at least I'll know I was brave enough to try." The decision gave her a sense of clarity, but it didn't erase her fears. She knew the odds were against her, not just because of their professional relationship, but also because of the unspoken prejudices that still lingered in society. Amelia's journey to this point, was a testament to her courage and authenticity. She had always faced life's challenges head-on, and this would be no different. Deep down, she hoped that David would see past the superficial barriers that society imposed and recognize the genuine love she felt for him. As she prepared herself to share her feelings, Amelia held on to the belief that love, true, unconditional love, had the power to challenge and change even the most deeply ingrained prejudices. Whether or not her feelings were reciprocated, she knew her decision to act was a victory in itself. This chapter in Amelia's life wasn't just about her love for David. It was about her willingness to confront her fears and embrace vulnerability in a world that often demanded she be invulnerable. Through her courage, she would learn one of life's most profound lessons, that even in the face of potential rejection, love is always worth the risk. The office was unusually quiet that evening. The usual hum of keyboards and low murmurs of conversation had given way to an eerie stillness. Amelia stood outside David's office door, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure anyone nearby could hear it. She clutched the edge of her notepad, her fingers trembling as she rehearsed her words one last time. "David," she whispered to herself, "I need to tell you something." But every time she imagined the conversation, doubt crept in, paralyzing her. What if he laughed? What if he dismissed her feelings? What if she destroyed everything she had worked so hard to build in this company? Taking a deep breath, she knocked softly on the door. David looked up from his desk, his expression warm, but curious. "Amelia, come in," he said, setting down a stack of papers. She stepped inside, her legs feeling like lead as she crossed the room. His office, with its sleek modern design and panoramic view of the city, suddenly felt overwhelming. The man she had admired for so long sat before her, completely unaware of the storm raging in her heart. "What's on your mind?" David asked, leaning back in his chair. Amelia's throat felt dry, her palms clammy. She forced herself to meet his gaze, even as her instincts screamed at her to turn and run. "David," she began, her voice shaking, "I've been meaning to tell you something for a while now." He nodded, his brow furrowing slightly. "Go on." She hesitated, her pulse racing. Then, with every ounce of courage she could muster, she said, "I've developed feelings for you. I love you." The words hung in the air like a fragile glass ornament, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. For a moment, David didn't move. He simply stared at her, his expression frozen in shock. "What did you just say?" he asked, his tone sharp and disbelieving. Amelia swallowed hard, feeling her chest tighten. "I love you," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. David stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. His face hardened, and the warmth she had admired so much was replaced with cold disdain. "Amelia, this is inappropriate," he said, his voice biting. "You're an employee, and besides, I'm not interested in you." Each word felt like a dagger, piercing the very core of her being. But he wasn't finished. "I have a beautiful white girlfriend who is everything I want," he added, his tone laced with finality. "You and it would never work. Now leave my office and don't bring this up again." Amelia stood there, stunned, as his words echoed in her mind. The rejection wasn't just a dismissal of her feelings. It was a harsh reminder of the societal barriers she had always feared. Her love, genuine and pure, had been reduced to an impossibility because of the color of her skin. Her vision blurred with tears as she turned and left the office. The walk back to her desk felt like an eternity. Each step was heavy, weighed down by humiliation and heartbreak. Once she was safely out of sight, she collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands as silent sobs racked her body. That night, Amelia sat alone in her apartment, her tears soaking the pages of her journal. She replayed the moment over and over, dissecting every word, every glance, every ounce of rejection. "Why wasn't I enough?" she whispered to herself. Why does my skin define my worth? Her mind spiraled into a storm of self-doubt and anger. She thought of all the times she had been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed because of her race. This rejection wasn't just personal. It felt like an affirmation of every prejudice she had ever faced. But as the hours dragged on, another feeling began to emerge. A quiet resolve. Yes, David's words had hurt her deeply, but they didn't define her. His inability to see her worth didn't diminish her value. By the time the sun rose, Amelia made a promise to herself. She would not let this moment break her. She would continue to excel, to thrive, and to love herself, even in a world that often refused to see her beauty. This painful chapter in her life taught her an important lesson. Rejection, no matter how brutal, is not the end. It's a stepping stone to something greater. And while David's prejudice may have shattered her heart, it could never extinguish her spirit. Time had done little to heal the wounds in Amelia's heart. Though she maintained her professional demeanor, the light in her eyes had dimmed. She avoided David whenever possible, keeping interactions strictly about work. Amelia buried herself in her tasks, pouring her energy into projects that kept her from dwelling on the heartbreak. She thought of him less and less, though the occasional mention of his name still caused a twinge of pain. David's life, however, appeared to be on an upward trajectory. He was the picture of success, commanding boardrooms, earning accolades, and planning an extravagant engagement to Emily, his longtime girlfriend. Emily, a beautiful and ambitious woman, was everything society celebrated, poised, charming, and as polished as David himself. Together, they seemed the perfect couple, the kind that graced magazine covers and dominated social media feeds. But beneath the surface, David's life wasn't as flawless as it seemed. While he enjoyed professional success, his personal life felt increasingly hollow. Emily's affection often felt transactional, her interest in him closely tied to his status and wealth. Yet, blinded by societal expectations and his own arrogance, David ignored the red flags. One fateful evening, the rain poured relentlessly, transforming the city streets into shimmering mirrors. David had just wrapped up an important business meeting, the kind that left him feeling untouchable. He stepped into his sleek black car, the tires splashing against puddles as he sped through the stormy night. The accident happened in an instant. A speeding truck barreled through a red light, skidding uncontrollably on the slick pavement. David had no time to react. The impact was deafening, shattering glass and twisting metal. His car spun violently before coming to a halt against a lamppost. When David regained consciousness, the world was a blur of flashing lights and distant voices. Pain seared through his body, and the weight of his injuries became apparent even before the paramedic spoke. He was rushed to the hospital, where a team of surgeons fought desperately to save him. Despite their efforts, the damage to his legs was too severe. The doctors had no choice but to amputate both limbs to save his life. When David awoke from surgery, the reality hit him like a tidal wave. He stared at the empty space beneath the sheets where his legs had once been, his mind refusing to process what his eyes saw. The man who had once walked into boardrooms with unshakable confidence was now confined to a hospital bed, unable to imagine a future without his independence. The days that followed were a blur of pain and despair. David's body was healing, but his spirit was broken. He struggled to adapt to the wheelchair that had become his new reality, each attempt to move a cruel reminder of what he had lost. Simple tasks, reaching for a glass of water, adjusting his blanket, felt insurmountable. Emily visited him at the hospital, her expressions a mix of pity and discomfort. "I'm here for you," she would say, but her words lacked warmth. David noticed her glances at the clock during her visits, the way her phone seemed more important than their conversations. One evening, as he lay in his hospital bed, David overheard Emily on a phone call. "I don't know if I can do this," she said, her voice trembling. "How can I build a life with someone who can't even walk? This isn't what I signed up for." Her words sliced through him, confirming what he had feared all along. Emily's love had never been unconditional. It was tied to his power, his stature, his ability to provide a picture-perfect life. Now that he was no longer the man society celebrated, her affection had withered away. David's world, once so full of promise and control, had come crashing down. He spent hours staring out the hospital window, watching the rain streak down the glass. The man who had once believed himself invincible was now grappling with vulnerability, rejection, and a profound sense of loss. In those quiet moments, David began to reflect on his life, his choices, his priorities, and the relationships he had nurtured. He thought of Amelia, her sincerity, her courage, and the pain he had caused her. For the first time, he saw himself through her eyes and understood the depth of the damage his rejection had inflicted. David's accident was not just a physical tragedy, it was a turning point. Stripped of his physical abilities and the illusions of perfection he had built his life around, he was forced to confront the person he had become. The journey ahead would be one of humility, redemption, and learning to rebuild his life, not as the untouchable CEO, but as a man seeking meaning beyond societal expectations. David lay in his hospital bed, his mind spinning with the thoughts of what his future might hold. The pain from the accident still throbbed through his body, but it was the emotional ache that was unbearable. In the quiet of the sterile hospital room, he began to wonder about the life he had built, his career, his image, his relationships. He had always believed that with enough success, he could keep the world at bay, that he could control his happiness. But now, faced with the harsh reality of his condition, David found himself vulnerable, questioning everything. His thoughts often drifted to Emily. She had been by his side throughout his rise to the top, a constant presence in the polished world of wealth and success. She had supported him, smiled for the cameras, and played the role of the perfect girlfriend. But now, as the man he was before had been shattered, he found himself desperately holding on to the remnants of their relationship. He needed something familiar, something that felt real. One evening, after hours of contemplation, David made a decision. He needed to feel some semblance of stability, some reassurance that love could survive even the most devastating of circumstances. He was still in a fragile state, physically and emotionally, but he clung to the hope that Emily would be there for him, that her love for him would rise above the superficial barriers they had once navigated. With a shaky hand, he called her. "Emily, can you come to the hospital?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She arrived late, her face wearing a mixture of concern and reluctance. The evening shadows cast a somber light on her face, and for the first time since his accident, David noticed the unease in her eyes. He had long been used to her glamorous persona, always composed, always perfect. But now, as he sat in a hospital bed, he wondered if he had ever really known her at all. "David, you look terrible," she said, her voice cold despite the attempt at concern. He offered her a tired smile. "I know, but I've been thinking a lot, and I want to make sure we don't lose what we had." Emily tilted her head slightly, her lips pursed. "What are you saying, David?" "I want to marry you," he said, the words heavy with a longing for the life they had once dreamed of together. "I know things are different now, but I need you. I want to be with you. I want to spend my life with you." The words hung in the air, fragile and hopeful. David looked at Emily, his heart in his eyes, as he awaited her response. This was the moment he had been waiting for. This was the life raft he had thrown out into a stormy sea, praying she would grab onto it. But as soon as the words left his mouth, he saw her face change. The warmth that had once radiated from her melted away, replaced by a look of disbelief and disdain. "Marry you?" Emily's voice rose, her tone sharp and full of anger. "Like this? Like this?" She gestured to his legs, her face twisted in disgust. I don't want to spend my life with a man who can't even stand on his own. This isn't the life I signed up for." David's breath caught in his throat. Her words were cruel, each one cutting deeper than any physical wound. His chest tightened, and he could feel the sting of humiliation, his heart sinking as he realized the truth he had been denying. Her gaze hardened, and she turned away from him, walking toward the door. "I'm sorry, David, but this is just too much for me. I can't do this." She spat. As she opened the door to leave, David reached out weakly, his voice faltering. "Emily, please, don't go. I need you." But Emily didn't even glance back. "Goodbye, David," she said coldly, slamming the door behind her. The sound of the door closing echoed in his ears, reverberating through his soul. In that moment, everything David had believed about their relationship shattered. He had spent years trying to build a life, to present the perfect image to the world, and Emily had been a part of that illusion. But now, with the truth laid bare, David saw her for what she really was. A woman whose love had been conditional, based solely on his wealth, power, and ability to fulfill a fantasy. His heart felt like it had been ripped out of his chest. The pain wasn't just from the loss of Emily. It was the devastating realization that her love had never been real. It had been tied to the superficial trappings of his life, to the man he had once been, the man who no longer existed. David sat in the empty hospital room, his body aching with both physical and emotional pain. The man who had once walked into rooms with confidence, who had been adored for his success, was now a broken shell of his former self. His legs were gone, and so was the woman he thought he loved. As he stared at the empty space where Emily had stood, David knew that this was the moment of reckoning. Everything he had built, everything he had believed in, had been stripped away. His world had crumbled not because of the accident, but because the woman he thought would stand by him in his darkest hour had abandoned him. And for the first time in his life, David realized that true love wasn't about appearances or success. It was about standing by someone when everything falls apart. He had been chasing an illusion of love, when in reality, the one thing he needed was the unconditional acceptance of another person. With Emily's departure, David was forced to confront the painful truth. In the end, it wasn't the life he had once built that mattered. It was the kind of person he was, and the kind of love he would eventually seek. But that journey, painful as it was, had only just begun. The hospital room was cold and sterile, the smell of antiseptic clinging to the air. David had become a shadow of his former self, his once confident demeanor replaced by a vulnerability he had never known. The pain from his accident still pulsed through his body, but it was the emotional anguish, the weight of his shattered world, that pressed hardest upon him. He felt abandoned, forgotten, and alone. The few visitors who came to see him were well-meaning, but their eyes always lingered on his wheelchair with pity or discomfort. The business world, the world that had once admired him, now seemed distant and indifferent. And then there was Emily, the woman he had loved, who had walked out on him when he needed her most. Her departure left him raw and broken, and the emptiness of his situation seemed all-consuming. It was then, on one particularly quiet afternoon, that the door to his hospital room opened softly. David looked up, expecting another impersonal visit from one of his business colleagues or perhaps a distant relative. But instead, standing in the doorway was Amelia, her presence like a quiet warmth that seemed to push against the cold isolation surrounding him. She walked in slowly, her smile gentle yet unwavering. In her hands, she carried a basket of homemade food, the kind of comfort food she had promised to bring him when they had once shared casual conversations in the office. Her dark eyes met his, and for the first time in months, David felt something other than pain. He felt a glimmer of hope. "Amelia?" he said, his voice hoarse, and for a moment he wondered if he was imagining her there. She set the basket down on the table beside his bed, arranging the contents with care before sitting beside him. The quiet, steady rhythm of her presence felt soothing, like a balm on a wound David hadn't realized was so deep. She didn't say anything at first. There were no rehearsed words or awkward silences. She simply sat with him, offering the kind of quiet companionship that spoke louder than any words. David swallowed hard, fighting the surge of emotion threatening to overtake him. "Why are you here, Amelia?" His voice trembled with guilt and confusion. "After everything I said to you, after how I treated you, I don't deserve your kindness." The words felt heavy, pressing down on his chest. He had been cruel, dismissive, and blind to her heart. Amelia had loved him despite all his faults, yet he had rejected her. Too caught up in his own arrogance, too convinced that people like her were beneath him. And now, after everything that had happened, he wondered why she would even want to be near him. Amelia smiled softly, her gaze tender and forgiving. "Because love isn't about what someone deserves," she said, her voice calm and steady, like a quiet river flowing over jagged rocks. "It's about what you give freely." Her words pierced David's heart, settling deep within him. They were simple, yet profound, an offering of grace that he had never imagined coming from her. Amelia had no reason to be kind to him. He had rejected her, humiliated her, and dismissed her love without a second thought. Yet, here she was, offering him not just food, but her presence, her care, and her forgiveness. David felt the weight of his own shame rise in his chest, threatening to choke him. He had been so blinded by his own pride that he couldn't see what had been in front of him all along. Amelia wasn't just a colleague or the woman he had hurt. She was a person of extraordinary strength, resilience, and kindness. She had been willing to love him despite the world's prejudices, despite his own flaws, and yet he had turned her away, thinking her love wasn't worthy. But now, as he looked at her, sitting quietly beside him, David began to understand. Amelia wasn't here because she owed him anything. She wasn't here to fix him or to gain anything in return. She was here because her heart was open, because her capacity for love wasn't defined by what he had done or who he had been. It was defined by what she could give, no matter how broken or flawed the recipient might be. Tears threatened to spill from David's eyes, but he blinked them away, not wanting to appear weak. Yet, in that moment, he realized how much he had been wrong. Not just about Amelia, but about love itself. He had spent his entire life thinking love was something to be earned, something to be proven by status or appearance. But Amelia had shown him that true love wasn't about who you were on the outside. It was about who you were on the inside, and how much you were willing to give without expecting anything in return. "I don't deserve you," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm so grateful you're here." Amelia simply nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "You don't have to deserve kindness, David. It's given because we see each other as human beings, and I see you." David didn't know how to respond. There were no words that could express the gratitude and awe he felt for her unwavering kindness in the face of everything he had done. In the stillness of the room, as he sat there in his wheelchair, he felt a profound shift within himself. The man he had once been, the arrogant, entitled CEO, was fading, and in his place, a more humble, introspective man was emerging. For the first time in his life, he truly saw Amelia, not as the woman who had once loved him from afar, but as a person capable of offering the kind of love he had never known. And in that moment, David realized that his journey toward healing wasn't just about his physical recovery. It was about finding redemption and maybe, just maybe, the chance to build a love that wasn't based on pride or race, but on mutual respect and kindness. Amelia's kindness was more than just an act of compassion. It was a lesson in what it meant to truly see someone. And as David sat beside her, he knew he had a long road ahead of him, but it was one he no longer had to walk alone. As the months passed, David's transformation was nothing short of extraordinary. The man who had once been consumed by his own pride and status had learned humility, vulnerability, and the power of unconditional love. The pain of his accident had opened his eyes to the things that truly mattered: his relationships, his values, and most importantly, the people who had stood by him when he had nothing left to give. And at the center of this transformation stood Amelia. She had been his rock, his teacher, and his greatest source of comfort. Her kindness, her strength, and her unwavering support had allowed David to see the world through a different lens. He had once believed that love was something to be earned, that it was about outward appearances, power, and wealth. But Amelia had shown him that true love had nothing to do with these superficial things. It was about seeing the soul of another person, recognizing their worth beyond what the world told them they should be. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garden of the house David had moved into after his recovery, David took Amelia's hand. The warm sunlight bathed them in its golden glow, and for the first time in a long while David felt a peace he had never known. He had rebuilt his life, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. But there was one thing he still needed to do. "Amelia," he began, his voice trembling with sincerity, "you have taught me the true meaning of love. You saw me when I couldn't see myself. You loved me when I was broken. And you showed me a strength I never knew I had. I don't deserve you. But I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I can be the man you believe me to be. Will you marry me?" Tears welled up in Amelia's eyes as she looked into David's face, her heart swelling with love for the man he had become. She had seen him at his lowest, and now she saw him at his most vulnerable, asking for her love not out of pity, but out of a genuine desire to share his life with her. "Yes, David," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I will. I love you." The moment was perfect, a symbol of the journey they had taken together, a journey that had been filled with heartache, rejection, and pain, but had ultimately led to this beautiful, life-changing moment. The road had not been easy, and the world around them had often been cruel and judgmental. But their love had survived, not because of their outward appearances or their circumstances, but because they had chosen to see each other for who they truly were. Their wedding was a celebration of not just their love, but of defying the societal expectations that tried to tear them apart. Friends, family, and colleagues who had once doubted their relationship now stood by them, witnessing a love that was pure and unbreakable. As they stood before their guests, exchanging vows and pledging their lives to each other, there was a palpable sense of triumph in the air. Amelia, now David's bride, stood before the crowd, her heart full of gratitude and conviction. She had never been one to shy away from speaking her truth, and now, more than ever, she felt the need to share a message with the world. The love that she and David had built was not just a testament to their personal bond, it was a challenge to the world, a challenge to look beyond the superficial divisions of race, status, and ability. She stepped up to the microphone, her voice strong and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her eyes sweeping over the crowd, "we live in a world that often seeks to define us by the color of our skin, the wealth in our pockets, or the limitations of our bodies. But love is not defined by any of these things. Love is defined by the courage to see beyond these barriers and embrace the soul within. It's about choosing to stand by someone when the world tells you not to, about giving love freely, without conditions or expectations." David stood beside her, his heart swelling with pride as he watched Amelia speak. He knew that their story, their love, had become a symbol, a beacon of hope for others who had been held back by the weight of societal prejudices. They had faced rejection, pain, and even hatred, but in the end, they had found a love that transcended it all. "David and I are proof that love can conquer prejudice, rejection, and pain," Amelia continued, her voice unwavering. "We are proof that true love doesn't care about the color of your skin or the number of limbs you have. It only cares about your heart, your soul, and your willingness to stand together no matter the odds." The crowd was silent, listening intently as Amelia's words sunk in. Some nodded in agreement, while others fought back tears, moved by the truth in her message. David squeezed her hand, his eyes shining with admiration for the woman he had come to love with all his heart. Their union became a powerful message to the world, a message that love was not confined by race, social status, or physical ability. It was a message that challenged societal norms and encouraged people to look beyond the surface, to see the humanity in others, and to embrace the differences that made them unique. As the wedding ceremony came to a close and David and Amelia shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the guests rose to their feet, applauding not just the couple, but the courage they had shown. David and Amelia had defied the expectations of a racist society, and in doing so, they had created a love that was stronger than any prejudice. Their love story became an inspiration, a reminder that no matter how broken the world may seem, there is always the possibility of healing, of redemption, and of love. It was a love that proved that even in the face of rejection, pain, and societal judgment, there is always the power to rise above it and create something beautiful.